Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving into one of the most, well, complex and fascinating bodies of literature out there,
Hmm.
the Bible. And for a lot of people, there's this real cognitive gap, I suppose, between the idea of a single ancient holy book and the historical reality of it.
That's right. The image versus the actual history.
Yeah, and we've been looking at sources that challenge some pretty major misconceptions, like the idea that the Bible was revealed all at once in, what, 4 different
That
languages?
is a really common one, yeah. And it's just not how it happened.
So our mission today really is to give you a kind of shortcut. We want to clear up the linguistic facts, the timeline, and then walk through these two really strongly contrasting views, Islamic and Christian, on how reliable those texts actually are today.
And that idea you mentioned, the Bible just sort of arriving fully formed, revealed to one person, that's the very first thing we need to, well, dismantle.
Okay.
You really can't think of the Bible as a book. It's much more like a library.
A library. Compiled over how long, just to give us a sense of scale?
Oh, we're talking about a collection of documents written across roughly 1,500 years.
Wow.
Yeah, from the earliest writings, people linked to Moses, through the prophets, the historical accounts, right up to the apostles writing the New Testament. It's an epic scale.
And that huge time frame, that scale, is why it gets linguistically complex.
Exactly. That's the key.
So this compilation process explains why we end up with 3 languages, not the maybe commonly thought 4. Can you give us the rundown on those 3?
Absolutely. So the Old Testament, the first major part, was written primarily in Hebrew. That makes sense. It was the language of the early Israelites.
Right.
But then, because history happens, empires shift, you find these smaller but still really significant parts of the Old Testament written in Aramaic.
Ah, okay. Like where?
Good examples are sections in the books of Daniel and Ezra. Aramaic became, the international language, the lingua franca after the Babylonian exile. For trade, diplomacy.
Makes sense.
Then you jump forward quite a bit in time to the New Testament. This part covers Jesus' life, the early church.
Yeah. And that entire section was originally written in Koine Greek.
Koine Greek.
Yeah, Koine, it just means common Greek. It was the everyday, widely spoken dialect across the whole Hellenized Roman world at that time.
So Hebrew, Aramaic, and Koine Greek. Got it. But if those are the 3, where does this confusion about 4 languages keep coming from?
It's almost certainly tangled up with the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
Ah, right. People hear 4 and think languages.
Exactly. They're talked about so much they're central. But they are not 4 different language versions of the same story. They're 4 distinct accounts, 4 narratives.
Written by different people for different audiences, maybe?
Precisely.
Yeah.
But all originally composed in that same Koine Greek. So 4 accounts, not 4 translations or language versions.
That's a crucial distinction. And what's fascinating, stepping back, is that this very structure, this multilingual, multi-century, sort of decentralized collection of texts, is really key to understanding the whole picture, isn't it?
It really is. It makes it structurally quite different from, say, the Quran, which, as you mentioned, arrived as a single text in Arabic.
That's a fundamental difference, yeah. The Bible's structure inherently reflects its long history. It's this collection that grew and evolved over nearly 2,000 years, written by lots of different authors in different places, different cultures, different political times.
Okay, that long timeline brings us quite naturally to Jesus, or Isa, right? The central figure of the New Testament.
Absolutely.
Given that the Gospels are about him, let's just clarify the chronology. Was he the one dictating or delivering these texts during his lifetime?
No, he wasn't. That's another area where we need some careful fact-checking.
Okay.
Jesus started his public ministry around age 30. His crucifixion was likely around AD 30, maybe 33. The critical point is that the Gospels, the accounts of his life and teaching, were written by his followers decades after those events.
Decades later.
Yeah. Mark's Gospel, for instance, is usually dated somewhere between AD 60 and 75. John's Gospel is generally seen as even later, maybe AD 75 to 100, possibly even a bit later.
So he's the subject, the focus. But his followers are the inspired authors, writing well after he lived.
That's the understanding, yes.
Which, thinking back to that misconception, completely pulls the rug out from under the idea that he needed to travel the world learning languages to deliver a finished, multi-language book himself.
Exactly. That whole scenario just becomes, well, irrelevant. It's based on a false premise.
So the question of what languages he actually spoke is still pretty interesting, right? It grounds him in his time and place.
Oh, absolutely. It tells us a lot about first century Galilee.
So what's the historical consensus? What languages would Jesus likely have used day to day?
The strong consensus is that his native language, the one he grew up speaking and used in daily conversation, would have been Galilean Aramaic.
Aramaic. Okay.
Yeah, Galilee was more rural, and Aramaic was the common Semitic language spoken there. And we have pretty good evidence for this in the Gospels themselves.
How so?
Well, even though the Gospels are written in Greek, they occasionally quote Jesus' actual Aramaic words directly.
Oh, like Talitha cum. Is that an example?
That's the perfect example. Mark records him saying Talitha cum, which means, little girl, I say to you, get up. It preserves the original sound.
Wow. Okay, so definitely Aramaic. What else?
He would have certainly known Hebrew. That was the language of the Jewish scriptures, the Torah. He'd need it for reading and discussing scripture in the synagogue.
Right, the religious language.
And then, given where Galilee was, lots of trade routes close to Hellenized cities like Tiberias and Sepphoris, it's highly probable he had at least some working conversational knowledge of Koine Greek as well.
Just from interacting with people.
Yeah, it would have been almost unavoidable in that multicultural environment, a practical necessity.
Okay, so that sets the scene for the composition of the Bible. Aramaic, Hebrew, Greek involved in different ways. Now we pivot to the, maybe the trickier part, the theological friction point over whether the text we have now is reliable.
Yes. This is where it gets really interesting and where you see two fundamentally different approaches clashing.
The whole question of textual preservation or alteration.
Exactly. How has the text fared over centuries of copying and transmission?
Let's start with the perspective that argues, yes, alteration has happened. That's the Islamic concept of tarif, right? What's the core idea there?
The core Islamic belief is that the original divine revelations given to earlier prophets, specifically the Torah given to Moses, which corresponds to the Torah, and the Injil given to Jesus, the gospel, were indeed authentic and from God.
Okay, so originally pure.
Originally pure, yes. But the belief continues, because these revelations were entrusted to human communities, they became subject to tarif.
And tarif means?
Corruption, alteration, distortion, change. The idea is that the human custodians didn't perfectly preserve what they were given.
Is this based on interpretation, or is it explicitly stated in the Quran?
It's stated quite explicitly in the Quran. Verses like those in Surah 2, verse 75, or Surah 5, verses 13 and 14, they form the basis for this belief. They accuse earlier communities, specifically Jews and Christians in context, of distorting words or forgetting parts of their revelations.
So the accusation is leveled directly in the text?
Yes. The underlying assumption is a failure of human preservation.
Now, I've heard that Islamic scholars make a distinction within tarif. There are different kinds. That seems important.
Yes, very important distinction. There are generally understood to be two main forms. The first is tarif al-manawi.
Manawi, meaning.
Distortion of the meaning or the interpretation. So in this view, the actual words on the page might be correct, but people twist or misinterpret what they mean.
Okay, so it's about understanding. What's the other type?
The other is tarif al-lafsi, and this one is much more direct.
Lafsi, meaning the words themselves.
Exactly. Lafsi refers to the actual physical alteration of the text itself, changing words, adding things, removing things from the manuscript.
So let me see if I get this. Amanawi is like saying, the text says stop sign, but you're interpreting it to mean yield.
Sort of, yeah. A misreading of intent.
Whereas al-lafsi is saying, the text used to say stop sign, but someone physically scratched it out and wrote yield instead.
That's a pretty good analogy, actually. Yes. One is an error in understanding, the other is a literal corruption of the written words.
And this belief in tarif, particularly al-lafsi, then logically leads to?
It leads to the theological necessity of the Quran. From the Islamic perspective, the Quran is seen as the final, flawless, perfectly preserved revelation sent specifically to correct the alterations and corruptions that had crept into the earlier scriptures like the Torah and the Gospel.
Okay, that framework makes sense from that perspective. Now let's contrast that sharply with the Christian viewpoint. They also acknowledge copying errors happened, right? But they come to a totally different conclusion about reliability.
They do. The Christian perspective is built on a combination of divine inspiration for the original authors and what they call providential preservation.
Providential preservation, meaning God oversaw the process.
In essence, yes. They absolutely don't deny that human errors occurred during copying. I mean, how could they? For centuries, it was all done by hand, no printing presses, scribes got tired, made mistakes.
Sure, that seems unavoidable.
But the argument is that God, through his providence, ensured that the essential core message, particularly the central doctrines about Jesus, his divinity, his death for sins, his resurrection, was preserved accurately and is attested to so widely across so many manuscripts that these minor human errors become theologically negligible.
So the idea is the core truth survived despite the small errors.
Exactly. They trust that the essential message endured through the messy human process of copying.
This takes us straight into the physical evidence then. The manuscripts themselves and these things called variants.
Right, textual variants. And here's a point of agreement. Both sides, Islamic and Christian scholars, and secular scholars too, agree that textual variants exist in the biblical manuscripts. Where they differ profoundly is on the significance and implications of those variants.
How many variants are we talking about? I've heard staggering numbers thrown around.
The numbers are staggering if you just count every single difference. We have, for the New Testament alone, something like 5,800 Greek manuscripts or fragments.
5,800.
Wow. And across all those, yes, there are hundreds of thousands of variations if you count every misplaced letter or changed word order.
That sounds bad. Like it undermines the whole thing.
Well, that's where you have to look closer. The vast, vast majority of these variants are incredibly minor.
Minor.
Textual critics, the scholars who study this, estimate that something like 99% of these variants don't actually affect the meaning in any significant way. There are things like spelling differences, different ways to spell a name, words being swapped in order, which often doesn't change the meaning in Greek, or obvious slips of the pen where a scribe maybe skipped a line or repeated a word.
So mostly trivial stuff, the kind of errors you'd expect from hand copying anything.
Pretty much. They're considered historically benign, interesting for tracking how texts were copied, but not impacting core Christian beliefs.
Okay, but you said 99%. That leaves 1%. Where's the real debate? What's in that remaining percentage?
That 1%, or maybe it's closer to 2%, depending on how you count, contains the significant variants. These are the ones that are genuinely debated by scholars.
And these are?
These are usually places where a phrase or even a whole section appears in some manuscripts but is missing from others, especially the oldest and generally most reliable ones.
Can you give an example?
The two most famous, widely discussed examples are probably the longer ending of Mark chapter 16, verses 9 through 20, and the story of the woman caught in adultery, which appears in many Bibles in John's Gospel, between chapter 7, verse 53, and chapter 8, verse 11.
And scholars think these were added later.
The broad consensus among textual critics, including many conservative Christian scholars, is that yes, these passages were very likely not part of the original text of Mark or John, but were added later by scribes for various reasons. They're usually marked as such in modern translations.
So the Christian perspective acknowledges these changes, documents them, but argues they don't overturn the main message.
That's generally the position. They argue the core message of salvation, the nature of Jesus, isn't dependent on these few debated passages.
This connects right back to the manuscripts. The Christian side admits they don't have the original autographs, the actual documents penned by Matthew or Paul, right?
Yeah.
Those were likely on papyrus and disintegrated long ago.
Correct. No original autographs are known to exist, but their argument pivots from originals to abundance.
Abundance of copies.
An overwhelming abundance of early copies. This is really the cornerstone of their claim to textual reliability. They point to fragments like P52.
P52.
It's a tiny scrap of papyrus, just a few verses from John's Gospel. But the incredible thing is its date. It's generally dated to around AD 125.
Wait, AD 125? John's Gospel was written maybe, what, AD 90, 100?
Exactly. So P52 shows us that John's Gospel was copied and circulating within maybe 30, 40 years of when it was first written. That's remarkably close for any ancient document.
That is close. Much closer than for, say, Plato or Caesar.
Oh, by centuries. For most classical authors, the earliest copies we have are 500, 800, even 1,000 years after they lived. So having a fragment from within a generation or two is a huge advantage.
So they rely on that proximity and the sheer number.
Yes. Combine fragments like P52 with later, but complete or near complete Bibles like the Codex Sinaiticus or Codex Vaticanus from the 4th century AD.
Codex, like a book.
Yeah, basically an ancient book format.
Yeah.
And you have thousands of other manuscripts. The argument is that by comparing all these witnesses, over 25,000 manuscripts in various languages, when you include versions and citations, scholars can identify and filter out the scribal errors and reconstruct the original wording with a very high degree of confidence.
What kind of confidence level do they claim?
You often hear figures like 99% or a 99.5% accuracy regarding the reconstructability of the original text. The idea is that the sheer volume of evidence allows them to triangulate back to the original, even without having the autograph itself.
Okay, that's the Christian approach. Quantity and early dating compensate for lack of originals.
Yeah.
How does that stack up against the preservation history of the Quran, which you mentioned was different?
It's a very different model. The Islamic tradition emphasizes a process that was rapid and, crucially, centralized.
Centralized how?
After Muhammad's death, concerns arose about variations in recitation. So under the Caliph Uthman around AD 650, a project was undertaken to compile an official standardized version of the Quranic text. Variant readings were suppressed, and this Uthmanic codex became the standard.
So one official version was established early on.
Yes. And because of this early standardization, the Muslim world relies on the consistency stemming from that authorized text. They also possess very ancient fragments, like the Birmingham folios or the Sana manuscripts, which date extremely close to Muhammad's lifetime, confirming the stability of that Uthmanic text from very early on.
So it's stability through early, authoritative standardization, rather than stability inferred from comparing thousands of later varied copies.
Exactly. Two different methodologies leading to different kinds of textual confidence and different debates.
Okay, this gives you, the listener, a massive shortcut, I think, to understanding why these two huge traditions view their foundational texts and each other's so differently. So wrapping this up, what does this all mean for you?
Well, I think it means you have to be really clear when discussing the Bible. You need to separate the historical facts of its composition from the theological claims made about its preservation.
Right. Fact one. It's a compilation over centuries. 3 main languages, Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek. Jesus is the subject, not the author of the New Testament books.
Correct. And fact two, the debate about alteration, about tarif versus preservation, is fundamentally a theological argument rooted in these very different histories of textual transmission, decentralized for the Bible, centralized for the Quran.
So now hopefully, when you hear someone claim the Bible was revealed in 4 languages, or maybe dismiss it entirely because of textual variance, you have some specifics.
Yeah, you can point to the actual languages, mention the early dating of things like P52, maybe even clarify the difference between distorting meaning, al-Manawi, and changing the text, al-Lafzi. It just grounds the whole conversation in reality.
It moves it beyond just assertion.
Exactly. And maybe the final thought to leave you with, sort of a provocative one, goes back to those manuscript numbers.
The 25,000 plus.
Yeah. The sheer volume of early biblical manuscripts we have is just unparalleled in the ancient world. Nothing else comes close. So the question becomes, does having thousands upon thousands of copies, which allows us to see and track minor variations, but also confirms the overwhelming consistency of the core message across all of them, does that ultimately provide a stronger case for the text's core reliability than relying on a single standardized early version where maybe variations were deliberately eliminated early on?
Confidence from massive messy data versus confidence from controlled uniformity.
That's a good way to put it. It's definitely a question worth exploring for yourself.